All right, good morning. You need to pray for my wife because we were enjoying ourselves, but because I enjoy preaching so much, we drove 6 hours back last night so that I can get here and be in the pulpit. So she would have liked very much to have spent some more time where we were, but unfortunately she married me. So pray for her. Today's message is, you can word it either way. We've never done it that way before, or we've always done it this way. And it's kind of the ways that the church and religious people tend to be, that we get into our traditions and the way we do things, and we think because that's the way we do things and it's our tradition, that that's the way it ought to be done. And every generation fights with the previous generation because they want to do something new and exciting, and we forget that we get our traditions and our religion in the way of discipleship and faith. We should be planting and instilling discipleship into our next generation. We should be instilling faith and not so much the tradition. And there's a story that kind of illustrates that, and I know you've probably heard it before, but I like it so much I'm going to say it again anyway, just so that I might hear it. There was this young bride who wanted to cook a family meal for both sides of the family. It was probably like a Christmas something, so she wanted to show off her cooking ability, and so she bought, as we typically do, a Christmas ham to make for the family. And when she gets it out, she starts to cut the ham into two pieces. Her husband goes, "What are you doing?" She goes, "I'm cutting the ham in two pieces because it tastes better." And he goes, "No, it doesn't. Why would you cut it into two places?" And she goes, "Well, my mother always did it that way. Every time we had Christmas dinner, she would take the ham and she would cut it in two and she would make it, and the ham was always very delicious. And so I'm just going to make it like my mother does because that's the way she makes it." And he goes, "I think you ought to call your mother because that doesn't make sense." So she calls her mother and says, "Well, Mom, you always cut the ham in two because that made it better, right?" She goes, "No. I always cut the ham in two because I never had a big enough pan for the ham to fit into one pan." And so many times we get so locked in our tradition, we don't know why we do what we do. We just do it because we think it's better. Now, what's going to happen in Jesus' situation, last week we took a look that they started to criticize Jesus because who he hung around with. He hung around with sinners. And no respectable rabbi would hang around with sinners and tax collectors. And now we're going to look at they're going to continue to criticize him for his disciples, what they do and they don't do. They're going to criticize them for what they do on a Sabbath, and then they ultimately are going to criticize him and be enraged at him what he does on a Sabbath. You see, people love to criticize rather than deserve something that's happening. And so in Luke chapter 5, verse 33, it says this. "And they said to him, 'The disciples of John often fast and offer prayers. The disciples of the Pharisees also do the same. But yours eat and drink.'" They're saying, "Wait a minute. You're supposed to be this great rabbi. And we're going to give you two examples of rabbis and traditions and how they're holy and religious. Because to be a holy person and to be a religious person, you ought to fast. And you ought to pray a lot. That's what holy and religious people do. And therefore, by implication, Jesus' disciples aren't. And if you want to be religious and you want to be holy, then you ought to do these things because this is what we have always done. You want to show that somebody that you're holy? You go around with a terrible face and say, "Oh, I'm so hungry. I haven't eaten for at least 2 hours. I'm famished, but I'm doing it for the Lord. And then I pray, and oh, my knees are so sore because I just pray and pray. I pray for you. It doesn't look like it's doing much good, but I'm praying for you." And that's what we do to be holy and religious. Your guys aren't doing that, Jesus. So what's up? And Jesus said to them, you cannot make the attendants of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? He's saying, when you're throwing a party, when you're having a wedding, now is not the time to be on a fast. Now is the time to celebrate. And he's saying, my disciples are the attendants to the groom. They're going to party because the bridegroom is with them. But the days will come, and when the bridegroom is taken away from them, then they will fast in those days. And they did. Not only did they fast and pray, they were quite frightened because they thought they were next. Verse 36, and he was also telling them a parable. No one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. Otherwise, both the new and the piece from the new, otherwise he will both tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. Now, those of you who are seamstress, you kind of get that, and the rest of us kind of figure it out. If you take a very new garment and you cut a hole out so that you can patch an old garment, you've already ruined the new garment. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. But then he says, so you've ruined that one garment, but you haven't really made the old one fixed, because everybody will see that this new piece of material is on this old piece of clothing, and you haven't accomplished anything. And then he says the second one, and no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled out, and the skins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. He's going to say, from our culture, when you make wine and you want it to ferment, what you do is you place it in a wineskin. And when it ferments, it starts to expand and cause the wineskin to expand and expand with the volume and the fermenting of the wine. But it says if you place it in an old wineskin, its elasticity is missing, and it will burst because as it begins to ferment, there's no more room. So Jesus says you're going to put new wine into new wineskins. And again, if you do so, you'll lose the wine and you'll lose the vessel, the wineskin. For no one, after drinking old wine, wishes for new, for he says the old is good enough. So his parable is basically saying, you're satisfied with your religion. You're satisfied with your practices. It would be a waste of time to tell you about something new. That I have a new kingdom that I'm establishing. But it will be a waste because you will be ruined and the teaching will be lost. So Jesus isn't too concerned with how they think they ought to fast and pray. Now notice Jesus doesn't defend fasting and prayer, nor does he say it's good, bad, or indifferent. He's just saying, stop comparing yourselves to my disciples. And so often we in church, we tend to compare ourselves with how we're going through in our life. And when we have gone through a certain thing and we've matured to that point, we wonder why no one else has matured to that point. And we go, well, can't you get over it? Well, you had a tough time getting over it. So stop comparing what Jesus has placed in you versus what Jesus has placed in the other. Luke 6. Now it happened that he was passing through some grain field on the Sabbath. Now the next few things are going to be related to the Sabbath. And the law was that you're supposed to rest on the Sabbath. Now there were some exceptions that you could do, like if an ox fell in a ditch, you could get the ox out of the ditch. And there were some exemptions to the rule. But the general rule was that you were supposed to rest on the Sabbath. And men being what men are, they decided to make rules and regulations based on the law. So that there was a certain area that you could walk on the Sabbath. And so when you'll see in the scripture, it'll say, they took a Sabbath day journey. That was that they only went as far as the law would allow them to go on the Sabbath. The Jews today take this provision about not working on the Sabbath so much so that if you were to go to Israel, and you were to go to an office building or a hotel that had multiple stories, every single light on every single floor would be illuminated, because that elevator is going to stop at every single floor on the way up and every single floor on the way down, because they interpret working as doing this. And therefore, to avoid ever violating the law, they manufacture all these rules and regulations. And so his disciples and Jesus were walking through some grain fields. And his disciples were picking the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating the grain. Now, under the law, you were allowed to pick grain from another person's field. But their regulations said that if you rubbed it together, that would be threshing, and that would be work. Therefore, you can't do it. It's really some great rules. But some of the Pharisees said, and it doesn't specifically state, other than the fact that some of the Pharisees, obviously the Pharisees are hanging around with Jesus to observe what he does. Not that they might become disciples, but to criticize him. And there are times it seems that if people hang out at church, not to follow Jesus, but to criticize those who are there. So they were rubbing their hands and eating the grain. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Obviously you're a sinner. Obviously you break the Sabbath. We're better than you." And Jesus answering them said, "Have you not even read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any to eat, except the priests alone, and gave it to his companions. And he was saying to them, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." He was saying, I'm going to take a rule that talked about not eating consecrated bread. But David was king. Therefore, David got to do a lot of things that other people don't get to do. As king, he had authority. And so he authorized himself and his companions to eat. Jesus said, someone greater than David is here right now. It is Son of Man. And he is the Lord of the Sabbath. So if he wants to make an exception to the Sabbath day rule, the Lord of the Sabbath may. Because he is the boss of the Sabbath. The Sabbath isn't the boss of him. And on another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And there was a man there whose right hand was withered, atrophied. And the scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find reason to accuse him. Now, I love the Pharisees. They are so consistent. You know exactly what the Pharisees are going to do every time. Now, I would think, if you're going to say, I'm going to watch to see if he can heal on the Sabbath, my first thought would be, well, if he does, that's significant because maybe God is with him because he just said he was the Lord of the Sabbath and now he heals. The second fact is, I haven't been around many people who've healed anybody. Now, I've been around some doctors and whatever, but I'm not too thrilled with their healing because usually they cut something out. Jesus lays his hands or speaks or touches and you're healed. So I would think it would be pretty impressive to watch somebody heal somebody, especially this guy who has a withered hand. You're not going to see that every day. So rather than saying, my goodness, this man maybe is the Son of Man, and maybe I should listen to him, and maybe I should pay attention to what he has to say. Instead, they're wondering if he'll heal so that they might accuse him rather than follow him. But he knew what they were thinking. Notice they didn't say it, they were thinking it. Jesus knows your thoughts and your intentions. But notice Jesus' knowing your thoughts and intentions doesn't change what Jesus is going to do. Because he could have said, the way to win friends and influence enemies is to not heal this man. I'll come back another time. But that's not Jesus' way. But he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." And he got up and came forward. Now notice, their objection and their criticism of Jesus is that he works on the Sabbath. Jesus doesn't even get up. He tells the man to come to him. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to destroy it?" So he knows what they're thinking. They want to accuse him on healing on the Sabbath because you're supposed to rest on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do things. So Jesus says, so I'm going to ask you a question. Is it okay to do good? Is it okay to heal? Is it okay to save a life on the Sabbath? If I see a chariot running down the street on a Saturday and a child is in front of that chariot, am I allowed to run out and save the child, or do I have to stand here and watch him or her die? Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath, to heal and to save? And after looking around at them all, which implies to me, they said nothing. If they had the guts of their conviction, they'd have said, no, it's not okay to do good on the Sabbath. That would have been kind of contrary to what God teaches, but they could have said that. But they said nothing. And he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." Notice, even Jesus again doesn't move. He just says to the man, "Come forward, now stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. Jesus didn't even speak other than stretch out your hand. Talk about the minimalistic amount of effort to heal. But they themselves were filled with rage. Can you imagine that? Jesus just took this man's hand who was atrophied, which means that he was limited in his service and ability and usefulness, and Jesus restores that. And instead of praising God or being thankful that the man's hand is restored, they are angered. And not just a little bit, they are ticked off that Jesus would heal on the Sabbath. Because we don't do it that way. You could have waited till Sunday. You could have waited a few hours until the sun set and it was Sunday. Then you could have healed the man. But sometimes the angriest people you meet are religious people. God is healing. God is granting salvation. God is giving sight to the blind. God is healing. And instead of rejoicing in what God is doing, well, how come he didn't do it for me? But he has. And he can. And he will. But our attitude is, we don't do it that way. The rules and the regulations say that you sing a certain number of songs and then you preach and then you go home. That's what we do. Sometimes, although I'm like everybody else, I heard today someone say, the difference between me and you is that I get to talk every week. And so, there's a part of me who likes the services at a certain time, so we can go out and have lunch at a certain time, and so we can do the things at a certain time. But would it not be unique, as some churches do, that their church service goes on and on and on until either Jesus shows up or Jesus is finished in that service. But we start at 10 o'clock and we try to end by 11:15, maybe 11:20. You start looking at your clocks after it goes a little past that. It's kind of like the story about the evangelist who came and asked the pastor how long he could preach. He goes, you can preach as long as you want. We're all leaving at 12. And that's kind of how we are. It doesn't matter whether Jesus showed up or not. No, it doesn't matter whether he's healed or not. It doesn't matter whether he's granted salvation or not. It's time to go. Because that's how we do things. And because Jesus did what Jesus does, because Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, and Jesus does good on Monday. Well, let me back up. Jesus does good on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. He does good on Wednesday, Thursday. He does good on Friday. And Jesus even does good on Saturday. But the religious were angry. But their anger didn't just stop at anger. And discussed together what they might do to Jesus. We got to stop this guy. Rather than saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? Maybe he is who he claims to be. Maybe he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Maybe his allowing his disciples not to pray and fast because he's there. And maybe because of their plucking grain and working to eat. And maybe healing on the Sabbath tells us something, that this man is no ordinary man. That this man is the Messiah. But instead of looking at the facts, they make a predetermined decision how to treat him because he doesn't fit in their box. He doesn't do it the way they've always did it. And so as a church, to me, the teaching that we need to get out of this is, number one, Jesus can do things even when we don't expect it. Number two, instead of looking at what the other disciples are doing and saying, well, I'm a disciple of this person or I'm a disciple of that person, that we're all a disciple of Jesus and we do what Jesus does. And instead of being so worried about what another disciple does and whether he's or she's doing what he or she ought to be doing, we ought to be concerned about what we're doing as a disciple of Jesus. And instead of being upset with that person for not following the program, we should be concentrated on the boulder or the log that is in our eye, and how we're not following him to the degree that we ought to be. So the next time we sing a hymn and you don't like hymns, say, I'm going to enjoy that hymn because there are other brothers and sisters in this congregation who do. And the next time we sing a song that's a little faster and maybe has a little more drum than we like, we ought to say, we're praising God. May not be how I praise God, but it's not about me anyway. And then we Baptists, because we don't want to be accused of being Pentecostal, we might even raise our hands to praise him and take the risk that somebody might think, well, maybe they're just praising God and they're not Pentecostal. They're not going to burst out and speaking in tongues. They're just going to raise their hands and saying, God, I surrender. I raise the white flag. God, I rejoice. Because our church is going to be a disciple and a follower of Jesus and not of the religious. And all God's people said.